The stale scent of spilled liquor clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of cigarette smoke that seemed permanently embedded in the peeling wallpaper. Lila sat slumped against the crumbling wall of her tiny apartment, her knees pulled to her chest as her head lolled forward, strands of unkempt hair hiding her face. The dim light of the flickering television cast uneven shadows across the room, illuminating the chaos around her. Empty bottles scattered like broken promises, a shattered picture frame on the floor, and the faint outline of a child's hand-drawn card peeking out from under the couch. She didn't move when the knock came. It was soft at first, but grew insistent, echoing in the silence. Lila forced herself to sit up, her head pounding as she squinted at the door. For a fleeting moment, her breath caught. Maybe it was Emily. Maybe her little girl had come back. But no, she knew better. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman in her crisp blazer, her expression a careful mask of professionalism tinged with pity. The social worker stepped inside, her heels clicking against the scuffed wooden floor. She carried an empty cardboard box, the weight of its purpose heavier than anything it could hold. "Lila," the woman began, her tone measured. "I'm here to pick up the rest of Emily's things." Lila swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stared at the floor, unable to meet the woman's eyes. She didn't need to hear the judgment in her voice. It was already playing on repeat in her head. How did it come to this? The social worker moved quietly, gathering the few remnants of Emily's presence. A pair of scuffed sneakers too small now, a pink backpack adorned with stickers, and a worn-out teddy bear missing one button eye. Each item felt like a fresh wound being ripped open. Lila's chest tightened as she watched the woman place them into the box with the kind of care Lila had once prided herself on. Before leaving, the social worker paused at the door. She hesitated, then placed an envelope on the kitchen counter. "This is from Emily. She wanted you to have it." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Lila alone once more. Her eyes lingered on the envelope, her trembling hands reaching for it. When she opened it, her breath hitched. The handwriting was messy, full of smudges, but unmistakably Emily's. "Mummy, I miss you." Tears spilled down Lila's cheeks, the words blurring before her. She clutched the letter to her chest, Emily's voice echoing in her mind. "I believe in you." Lila couldn't let go of the letter. Emily's scrawled handwriting filled every empty space in her chest, leaving her breathless. The words weren't just hopeful, they were a lifeline. Her trembling hands folded the letter neatly, tucking it back into the envelope as if to preserve its power. But the quiet apartment loomed around her, heavy and suffocating, filled with the echoes of everything she'd lost. She stared at the empty bottles scattered across the floor and felt the sharp sting of realization. The alcohol, the cigarettes, the nights spent numbing herself. It hadn't just taken Emily, it had taken Lila too. Somewhere along the way she had stopped being a mother, stopped being the woman who sang lullabies and braided tiny pigtails before school. She was just a shell now, hollow and echoing with regrets. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a reminder for her weekly check-in with Child Protective Services. She had skipped the last two. The reminder didn't care about her excuses. Neither would the caseworker. Why even go, she thought bitterly. It wouldn't change anything. But as her fingers brushed against the envelope again, she took a deep breath. Emily believed in her. She had to try.
The walk to the CPS office was short, but it felt like miles. Lila kept her head down, avoiding the judgmental stares she imagined on every passing face. She hadn't showered in days, and the oversized hoodie she wore hung limply on her thinning frame. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her failures were pulling her into the cracks of the pavement.
When she entered the sterile waiting room, the receptionist barely looked up. Lila sat in the corner, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She clutched the envelope tightly, a talisman against the shame that threatened to swallow her whole. Lila Monroe? The caseworker's voice was clipped, professional. A woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and an expression that Lila couldn't decipher, stood in the doorway. Lila nodded and followed her into a small office, her heart pounding. Inside, the caseworker gestured for her to sit. "You missed your last 2 appointments," she said, her tone even but firm. "If you're serious about wanting your daughter back, you need to take this process seriously." Lila swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I know. I'm sorry." The caseworker didn't soften. "Sorry isn't enough, Miss Monroe. The court needs to see progress. Right now, the foster family is doing a wonderful job with Emily, but you have to prove that she's better off with you. Can you do that?"
Lila hesitated, tears pricking at her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she pulled out the envelope and placed it on the desk. She wrote me this," she managed to say.
The caseworker glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What are you doing to get better, Lila? What steps have you taken?"
Shame flooded her. "Nothing," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't even know where to start." For the first time, the caseworker's expression softened just slightly. "Starting is the hardest part," she said. "But if you want to do this for yourself and for Emily, you need to commit. Have you considered treatment, rehab?" The word hung in the air like a challenge. Rehab. It felt like admitting she was broken beyond repair. But wasn't she already? The letter in her pocket seemed to pulse against her skin, reminding her of what was at stake. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "Tell me what I need to do." The treatment center wasn't what Lila had expected. It wasn't cold or clinical. Instead, it felt almost warm. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and there were flowers on the tables in the common areas. But it was still daunting. Every step inside felt like peeling away another layer of herself, exposing raw nerves she'd spent years trying to numb.
She was assigned a counselor, a no-nonsense woman named Martha who didn't sugarcoat anything. "You're here because you've hit rock bottom," Martha said during their first session. "But the good news is, there's nowhere to go but up, if you want it."
Lila wasn't sure if she wanted it, not yet. But she thought about Emily's letter, the messy handwriting, and the belief shining through every word. She wanted that. The first few days were unbearable. Detox hit her like a freight train, headaches, nausea, shaking, and the overwhelming urge to run, but there was no running. Martha was relentless, checking in on her every few hours, pushing her to confront the reasons behind her addiction.
"You can't just stop drinking," Martha said one afternoon, her voice firm but kind. "You have to figure out why you started in the first place." Lila didn't want to think about why. It hurt too much, but she couldn't ignore Martha's piercing gaze. "I was overwhelmed," she admitted after a long pause. "I felt like I was drowning. Emily's dad left, and I didn't know how to do it all on my own."
"And the alcohol helped you cope," Martha said, not unkindly. "Until it didn't." Lila nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It took everything," she whispered. "It took her." Weeks turned into months. Slowly, Lila began to rebuild herself. Group therapy sessions became a lifeline, a place where she could share her pain without fear of judgment. She connected with other parents who had lost their children to addiction, finding strength in their shared stories.
She wrote letters to Emily every day, even though she couldn't send them. They were filled with apologies, promises, and memories, like the time they built a pillow fort in the living room and stayed up all night telling stories by flashlight. Writing them reminded her of the mother she used to be, the mother she wanted to be again. Her visits with Emily started small. At first they were supervised, awkward and stilted, as Lila tried to bridge the gap her addiction had created. But Emily's warmth never wavered. She would wrap her tiny arms around Lila's neck and whisper, "I'm proud of you, Mummy." Each visit became a little easier, a little brighter. They played games, read books, and talked about school. Emily's foster family was supportive, encouraging the bond between mother and daughter. One day, after a particularly good visit, Lila sat down with Martha in her office. "I'm scared," Lila admitted. "What if I mess up again? What if I lose her for good?" Martha leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You've come a long way, Lila, but recovery isn't about never falling. It's about learning to get back up. And you're proving every day that you can."
Lila nodded, trying to let the words sink in. She still didn't fully believe in herself, but Emily's belief in her was enough to keep her going. As Lila neared the 6-month mark in her recovery, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The court date to reassess her custody was approaching, and while the outcome wasn't guaranteed, she was determined to fight for her daughter. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high, wearing a simple dress and clutching a binder filled with evidence of her progress: therapy records, letters from her counselor and group leader, and photos of her supervised visits with Emily. She spoke honestly about her journey, her failures, and her commitment to change. The judge listened carefully, and while his decision wasn't immediate, Lila felt a glimmer of hope in his final words. "You've come a long way, Miss Monroe. Keep proving that you can provide a stable, loving home for your daughter, and we'll revisit this soon." The weeks that followed were a test of patience and perseverance. Lila threw herself into her recovery, attending meetings, working a steady job, and continuing to strengthen her bond with Emily. One evening, after a supervised visit at the foster family's home, Emily handed Lila another letter. This one was shorter, but no less powerful. "You're my hero, Mummy. I love you." Tears blurred Lila's vision as she hugged her daughter tightly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was walking towards something instead of running away. Lila held Emily's letter against her chest as she sat in her small but tidy apartment, sunlight filtering through the newly hung curtains. It wasn't much, but it was home, a far cry from the chaos of the space she once called her own. The faint smell of fresh coffee filled the air, a testament to the small victories she had accumulated over the past year. Sobriety, steady work, a healthier body, and a clearer mind, each day was another step forward. Yet, the fight wasn't over. The court's decision on full custody loomed over her like a storm cloud, but Lila had learned something invaluable through her journey. Strength came not from certainty, but from persistence. She had just finished tidying up Emily's room, a room her daughter had yet to sleep in, but one she had poured her heart into creating. It was simple, a twin bed with bright, mismatched sheets, a second-hand bookshelf,
filled with stories they used to read together, and a colourful rug she found at a thrift store. To anyone else, it might seem modest, but to Lila it was a sanctuary, a promise that Emily would come home someday. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter snapped her from her thoughts. Her stomach clenched as she saw the name on the screen, CPS Caseworker. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Lila Monroe?" the familiar voice asked. "Yes, this is Lila." Her voice was steady, but her grip on the phone tightened. "I wanted to let you know that the court has finalized its review. The judge has decided to grant you full custody of Emily, effective immediately." The words hit her like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. "Wait," she whispered, her voice breaking. She's coming home."
"Yes," the caseworker replied, her tone warm. "You've done an incredible amount of work, Lila. You've proven that you're ready to be the mother Emily needs. We'll arrange for her to move back in with you this weekend." Tears streamed down Lila's face as she thanked the caseworker. The moment she hung up, she sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Relief, joy, fear. They all tumbled together in a whirlwind. She had dreamed of this day for so long, but now that it was real, she felt the weight of the responsibility ahead. The day Emily came home was unseasonably sunny, as if the universe itself had decided to mark the occasion. Lila stood on the porch, her hands nervously smoothing down the front of her dress. The sound of a car pulling up made her heart race. She watched as Emily stepped out of the back seat, clutching her worn teddy bear in one hand and a small suitcase in the other. Emily's foster parents, a kind older couple, guided her toward the house. They gave Lila a warm smile and a nod. "She's been counting down the days," the foster mother said softly, before stepping aside to let Emily go. For a moment, Lila froze. Then Emily broke into a run, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Lila dropped to her knees, holding her daughter tightly, her tears soaking into Emily's hair.
"You're really here," Lila whispered.
"I told you I'd wait, Mommy," Emily said, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. The foster parents lingered for a moment before saying their goodbyes. They exchanged hugs with Lila, offering words of encouragement. As their car drove away, Lila stood in the doorway, her arm around Emily, marveling at the fact that her daughter was finally home. The first few days were filled with a mix of joy and adjustment. Lila and Emily settled into a routine. Breakfast at the small kitchen table, walks to the park, reading bedtime stories under the soft glow of the lamp in Emily's room. The moments were simple, but they were everything Lila had dreamed of.
Still, there were challenges. Emily had questions about the time they spent apart. "Why did you leave me, Mummy?" she asked one night, her voice small but steady. Lila's heart broke at the question, but she had promised herself she would be honest. "I didn't leave you, sweetheart," she said gently. "I got lost. I wasn't taking care of myself the way I should have, and it made it hard for me to take care of you. But I never stopped loving you, not for a single second."
Emily looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm glad you found your way back."
As Lila and Emily settled into their new life, Lila found herself thinking about the people who had supported her. Her counselor Martha, her group therapy friends, even the kind foster parents who had cared for Emily when she couldn't. She wanted to give back. With the encouragement of her support group, Lila began volunteering at a local shelter for women struggling with addiction. She shared her story, hoping to inspire others who felt trapped by their circumstances. She spoke about the letter that had changed her life, how a few words from her daughter had reminded her of the person she wanted to be. Her work at the shelter became a source of strength and healing. She met women who were at the start of their journeys, their pain and fear mirroring her own from months before. "You're stronger than you think," she would tell them. "And when you feel like you can't keep going, find one thing to hold on to. For me, it was my daughter. Find your reason and don't let go." One afternoon, Lila received a call from the shelter director. A speaking engagement at a community event had opened up, and they wanted Lila to share her story. At first, the idea terrified her. Standing in front of a crowd, bearing her soul, but she thought of Emily's unwavering belief in her and agreed. The day of the event, Lila stood backstage, clutching the letter Emily had written her. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. The audience was silent as she began. She spoke about her descent into addiction, the pain of losing her daughter, and the long, grueling path to recovery. But more than that, she spoke about hope, how Emily's simple words had sparked a fire in her that refused to be extinguished. "When I thought I had nothing left, my daughter reminded me that I still had her," Lila said, her voice steady, "and that was enough to make me fight for my life." The audience erupted into applause, and as Lila stepped off the stage, she saw Emily waiting for her, beaming with pride. Months turned into years, and life continued to evolve. Lila and Emily grew stronger together, their bond unshakable. Lila continued her work at the shelter, eventually becoming a full-time counselor. Emily thrived at school, her laughter filling the spaces in their home that had once felt empty. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Emily curled up beside her mother and said, "Mummy, I'm glad you didn't give up." Lila kissed the top of her daughter's head, tears shining in her eyes. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Their journey wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was theirs, and it was filled with love, hope, and the promise of better days. Lila had fought her way back from the edge, and in doing so, she had discovered the strength to rebuild not just her life, but the life of the one person who mattered most, her daughter.